like in the context of war, where somehow it seems many guys, perhaps because their own time horizons have shifted, the perceived risk of mortality has skyrocketed, or perhaps because the costs seem to have vanished. But many guys seem to become rapists in war who would not otherwise have become rapists.
This was Martin Daly, Emeritus Professor of Psychology, Neuroscience and Behavior at the McMaster's University in Hamilton. Violence, murder, the ultimate betrayal of human decency, or is it something deeper, something far more primal? Today we confront one of the most chilling and uncomfortable truths about human nature. The idea that killing is not just a social failure, but a part of our evolutionary DNA. If that sounds shocking, you're not alone, and you're in for an eye-opening conversation. Welcome back to Soulkeeper Analytics, where we challenge mainstream narratives and dive deep into global events. I'm Thomas Karat, your host, presenting weekly insights from recognized thought leaders like diplomats, academics, intelligence experts, and sometimes activists of some sort. So join us as we uncover the hidden stories beneath the headlines. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble, X, TikTok, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or any of your other preferred podcast platforms. And if you want to discover more about why people kill, a topic covered in the interview, join me on Substack. It's free and you get unfiltered, in-depth analysis without big tech algorithms and bias. A link is in the description below. As you probably already noticed, Martin is no ordinary academic. He's a provocateur, a fearless thinker who spent decades unraveling the patterns of violence that most people would rather ignore. Together with the late Margot Wilson, Martin co-authored Homicide, a book that flips our understanding of murder on its head. It argues that homicide isn't random or inexplicable. It's a strategy rooted in survival, competition, and human evolution. Think about it. Why are men far more likely to kill than women? Why do stepchildren face higher risks in their own home? Why does a perceived insult between strangers sometimes end in bloodshed? These aren't just questions for law enforcement, they're questions about who we are as a species. As you will see, Martin's research doesn't shy away from the uncomfortable answers. Today we dig into the most controversial ideas from his work. Are humans wired for violence? Can we really hold people accountable for behaviors that have ancient evolutionary roots? And what does all this mean for justice, morality, and the way we police our communities? Mind you, this conversation isn't for the faint of heart. But if you're ready to face the unsettling truth about why people kill, Martin is the man to guide us through the darkness. But before we do, a quick call to action. Some of the best interviews on this channel are shadow banned, which means YouTube is not presenting them to you, the viewer. The latest example is my interview with James Bamford, where we discussed the truly amazing story that underlies Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption scandal. Did you know that a Hollywood billionaire not only stole nuclear secrets from America, but then sold them to Israel, and that Netanyahu helped him to stay out of troubles to this very day? And then Netanyahu turned around and started to ask for favors, hence the bribery charges in Israel against him. Other examples are the interviews with the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen, or the interview with the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, who told me that the white powder in the test tube that Colin Powell showed the world when he testified at the UN just before the war on Iraq was actually salt. So if you're interested in content that apparently you're not supposed to see, content that goes against the mainstream narrative, have a look at some of the previous interviews that we have recorded for your pleasure. And of course, it really helps to spread the news if you like and subscribe to this channel. Professor Martin Daly, I hope I pronounced it now correctly. Thank you so much for joining. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And you?
Now that I have you on, I'm great. considering the fact that you're virtually on the other side of the globe. So for you, it's now, what was it, 9:30 a.m.
It
And for
is.
me, it's like 6:30 p.m.
Yeah.
So thanks to the technology, we can have these kind of conversations.
Yeah, 9:30 a.m. isn't a bad time for me. I've had my first cup of coffee.
Good, good. So let's go right into it. So you, I should explain. Yeah, I should give a little bit of context before we begin. So I started to be interested in evolutionary psychology, and I will ask you in a moment to encapsulate what is evolutionary psychology. I started to be interested in about, I think about 10, 12 years ago. And by chance, I happened to come across an interview from Professor Garzard because he wrote the book Consumer Instincts, which I think I read it 3 times. But in this interview, he said, okay, he didn't know what to study. And then his professor, unfortunately, I don't know anymore who his professor was, said to him, read this very book. So I did the same thing. I bought this book, and it's really an eye opener when it comes to, how shall I say this? Encapsulate. I don't want to minimize it on homicide, but when it comes to why men kill men, while why women kill men, etc. What seems, I think it's in this book that you describe a situation where a policeman says, there is no reason. It was absolutely nonsensical. Not true. Looking through your lens, suddenly things make sense. Okay. So that's the backdrop of me trying to reach out to you already quite a while. And now you come back to my first question. In a nutshell, Professor, what is evolutionary psychology?
My definition isn't necessarily the same as somebody else's, but I think evolutionary psychology is just the ordinary pursuit of psychological science with cognizance of the fact that the human psyche has been shaped by a history of natural selection, with that in the back or sometimes the forefront of your mind as you propose psychological and test psychological hypotheses. Does that help?
That was a very short description. Okay, so I had a look. Yeah, so there is a study from 2009. It was done from the Pew Research Center, and it found that 97% of scientists, meanwhile, accept Darwin's theory of evolution, means evolution through natural selection. Okay, but if we then narrow it down to only psychologists, it's about only 50% of psychologists, which is much less than scientists, yeah, accept evolutionary psychology as a valid tool. So it seems that up until the neck, most of the scientific community accepts, evolution. But when we talk about the brain, no, 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 that can't be. So what's your response to
Yeah,
that?
I'm. What year was that? I'm hoping that progress is being made on this, but
2009.
2009, not so
So
terribly
in
off.
2009, 97% of scientists, general scientists, already agreed, yes, evolutionary theory
Evolution.
of evolution is okay.
Yeah,
But, okay, the 50% of the psychologists, I do not know when this study was. I don't know exactly which year it was.
yeah,
Yeah.
but okay. Anyway, I mean, perhaps 97% of the psychologists accept Darwin's theory too, for all I know. I'd be surprised if it's terribly much less. Um, but but there is a sort of has been a widespread prejudice against evolutionizing about the human mind. And people trained in psychology, people trained in the social sciences, don't necessarily have a terribly good grasp of what evolutionary biologists do and think. And they tend to have internalized a false dichotomy between biological and social explanations of phenomena. Um, which, when you think about it, is kind of zany because, like, nothing except biota has sociality. I mean, social phenomena are biological phenomena if biology means the science of life as it does. Um, but people, I don't know, there's a widespread perception that evolutionary explanations are somehow more deterministic than other explanations or a Darwinian explanations. Um, there's a whole bunch of what I think of as prejudices and misunderstandings behind um, antipathy to evolutionary psychology.
Mm. So I would like to run something by you. So in my mind, the kind of concept that I found in my mind. Yeah. So we have a modern skull, but we still have an ancient mind. I specifically don't say brain, mind. And in this ancient mind brain, we have, I call them programs, which go back to ancestral times. And these programs can triggered by contemporary situations. Would that be a correct description?
I'm ambivalent about that. I like it and I don't like it. I mean, I don't like the implication that that which is evolved is what pre-cultural, pre is somehow only primordial and doesn't deal with environmental novelty well. I mean, the human animal has evolved to be an exploiter of novelty. We're terribly good at invading novel habitats, at exploiting novel resources. Um, Arguably, that's part of our evolutionary heritage. So, in that sense, the sort of ancient versus new kind of seems to be rubbing things a bit the wrong way. And yet, I take your point. There is certainly justification for saying the human animal, including the most general attributes of the human mind, haven't changed a hell of a lot in the last several 100,000 years, where technology um, and economic reality have changed enormously.
The context that I would like to put this conversation in, with your kind permission, and because you wrote Homicide and Killing the Competition, right? It's about human violence. And what we are seeing today, we have today 55 hot wars going on, two of which are constantly in the media. That is, of course, in Gaza and in Ukraine. So I was wondering if I could pick your brain, so to speak, in regards to the evolutionary roots of that type of violence. And that's also one of the 5 points that I would like to discuss with you, yeah, the evolutionary origins of human conflict. And the first question I would have in this context is, how do competition for resources, and this, when I read about this, the conflict in Gaza and in Israel is a classic conflict about resources. So how do competition for resources and status at an individual level scale up to group conflict and warfare?
Yeah, no, that's a difficult question, and I'm not sure scaling up is going to capture it all. I mean, certainly the psychology of individual aggressivity and conflictualness plays some role in the mentality of your Benjamin Netanyahu's um, and other people. Um, so there's certainly an element of the psychology of male-male conflict, of individualized conflict being played out among the participants in warfare decisions. But war is a more of a especially modern warfare is more of a strategic decision at a larger group level usually. I mean, maybe not. Maybe it's fair to say that actually individual actors are enormously important in in the sources of contemporary wars, maybe. Um, but I don't think they're about exactly the same thing. At some level of abstraction, they are. Resources are scarce. Um, people are motivated to have their share, and indeed more than their share, at the expense of others. Um, and that's true in individual conflict, and that's true in group conflict. Um, you know what? Why things have devolved the way they have in Israel and Palestine or in Ukraine? Um, why Vladimir Putin decided that reasserting the glory of Imperial Russia was somehow an essential agenda, has a lot to do with individuals and their choices of actions. So I guess understanding those individuals as evolved human beings is going to help. I'm sorry I can't be much more helpful than that.
Perfectly fine. So if we take it away from the individual, in evolutionary terms, what are the benefit of violence, of violence, of violent conflict between groups? And I'm saying this because we know that chimpanzees go to war. They not only form bands and groups to
Yeah.
hunt, but they go specifically to war. And I know this because I interviewed Frans de Waal. He's a Dutch zoologist who has observed this. Yeah. So from that perspective, and I think this war gene, if you like, goes very deep into ancient human history. So there must be an evolutionary benefit to war,
Well,
psychologically
I
speaking.
mean, clearly victors in warfare have, left more descendants than the losers have it's a way to proliferate is to usurp the lands of others, to annihilate your enemies in some cases. And people have been motivated to do that, and it's a marvel of human cooperation that they don't annihilate their enemies more often, or a marvel of human negotiation, I guess, that they don't annihilate their enemies more often. But in that sense, I think the benefits are obvious. Whether warfare has had selective consequences that have shaped the human psyche to be different than it would be in its absence is a bit trickier. Certainly, our spectacular ability to cooperate in ventures with non-kin, to collaborate with people who are not our relatives, is unmatched in the non-human world, I think it's fair to say. And there are good arguments that this capacity evolved in the shadow of between group conflict, that cooperation is the sort of ironic consequence of the threat of of alien groups. That's why we're so good at cooperating, is because if we weren't, we'd be dead meat. Um, I find that fairly convincing. What it tells me about the nature of the human animal, I don't know. I guess it says that cooperation and between group conflict have been handmaidens, have been mutually influential forces for a very long time in human history and evolution.
What about tribalism? How strong a role does tribalism play in modern warfare?
Um, I don't know. I mean, depends how you define it, I suppose. Certainly, you know, there's an argument to be made that the war in Gaza, as you mentioned, is between two groups who define themselves as competing ethnies, and they each are often deprecated the others collectively. That a lot of what is decried as anti-Semitism in the Western world right now, um, on behalf of the Palestinians, is framed in sort of ethnic group versus ethnic group terms, um, you know, and obviously Mr. Putin's insistence that there's no such thing as a Ukrainian, they're all just a bunch of Russians who speak the language badly, is of that ilk too. I'm thinking about what other major wars are going on in the world, in Sudan and so on. I suspect they all have an element of this, of even if they are not properly wars um, between groups with any history of tribal distinctness. I don't know what's an example, the American Civil War or something. Even a war that is in no way between two separable um, groups of that sort, people invoke the sort of language and psychology of in-group, out-group um, justification in these contexts. I think it's a readily accessible way of, you got to think us versus them, we versus they, and in that context, we something or others with a label, we Canadians versus those Dutch, or something, is is a direction that people's minds quickly run to. But is it always at root about that? Seems these days like maybe it is, but you think about other wars and it seems less so.
If we talk about economic inequality, and I know that you have written about that, yeah, in as much could we relate economic inequality? I mean, again, Gaza is very tempting, yeah, to the fact of war.
Yeah, I haven't thought too hard about this. I mean, I think of economic inequality as, I've made the case at length that economic inequality is the principal driver of different rates of interpersonal violence within societies. Um, Obviously, a colonized people or a people who see themselves as oppressed are usually going to be economically disadvantaged as part of that perceived oppression. And yet, it's hard to imagine what colonial like oppression and resentment could even be like in the absence of some economic inequality between the groups.
Let's pause this just for 30 seconds, because if you're captivated by this conversation, you will want to hear this. Over on my Substack, I have written an article that cuts straight to the heart of one of humanity's darkest mysteries. Why do people kill? It's free, it's raw, it's controversial, and it's filled with insights that will challenge everything you thought you knew about violence. Unless, of course, you have read Martin's book Homicide. If you are ready for answers that go beyond the headlines, subscribe to my Substack. It's free and the link is below in the description. You don't want to miss this one. When we take a step back and look at male aggression, reproductive competition, and maybe only then have a look at warfare. Yeah, but let's start with male aggression and reproductive competition.
Yeah, I mean, my my background is in non-human animal behavior. I only started working on humans in the you know after I had an academic job, after I'd done postdoc research. I'm a rodent guy who studies desert rodents and tries to understand the differences between related species of desert rodents. Um, and I've always, as long as I can remember, going back to my undergraduate days, I've been cognizant of the general prevalence of sex differences in same-sex violence in mammals, and the standard argument for why that is so. Why are males more inclined to kill one another or be violent to one another than are females? And the usual argument is that the variance in male success is higher, um, ultimately because females, in the human case, women, um, are limited in their reproductive capacity by energy and resource accrual. men are limited primarily by access to women, and there are famous cases of men having many, many, many more children than any single woman could bear. And that calculus in the background makes male-male competition more fraught because a higher proportion of males than of females who are newborn is going to die childless, and some of them are going to have higher than average, higher reproductive success than any female. That's true of most mammals. It's less true of human beings than of most other mammals, but it's still somewhat true of human beings. And arguably, human beings have smaller sex differences in aggressivity and many other related attributes than most mammals, but still in the same direction as most mammals. So, ultimately, I think male-male competition is due to the fact that, or the extremeness, the danger of male-male competition is due to the fact that the prizes for winning are big and the penalties for losing are big, um, and that the range of outcomes has tended to be narrower for females historically, making the readiness to resort to violence, risky violence, lower. That's I think a classic argument for why there are sex differences in interpersonal violence and in particular same-sex violence.
I heard the argument that monogamy is actually in the benefit of men, not necessarily in the benefit of women. And although that sounds like an oxymoron at the very beginning, yeah, if you think about it, there are certainly arguments being made that a woman which is bonded, married, whatever how you call it, with a low status male, maybe even aggressive, would have a better life with another high ranking male who already has, I don't know how many women.
Yeah.
But in order to prevent social upheaval, yeah, and this is where the benefit for male comes in from the monogamy, because monogamy ensures more or less that every male gets a female, right? We are kind of 50-50. It's not exactly, yeah, it's kind of 50-50. But without that, our societies probably wouldn't function. So again, monogamy is probably more advantageous, offers more advantages to the males than to the females. So I was wondering, what's your
Well,
view on
I
that?
mean, collectively, of course, if the default were a more polygynous circumstance where some despot managed to monopolize a harem, um, it's obviously let legislated limits on the degree of that sort of monopolization are obviously to the benefit of the disenfranchised men. They're not to the benefit of the winning guys. Um, they're, I'm sure many high status men well, many high status men have mistresses, I suppose, um, but many high status men think that may fantasize that a more polygynous world would be a happier one for them. But yeah, the argument from the so-called polygyny threshold model, the idea that if there's enough difference in the quality or material circumstances of men, then at some point, if females are allowed to choose their partners, you'd really rather be the second wife of a well-endowed man, whatever that means, not financially or whatever, than of some loser schlub who's just going to use violence to keep you around. Um, so yeah, that much makes sense.
When I read Consumer Instinct, yeah, from Professor Garzard, I came away with the feeling that basically, and I make it consciously very black and white, but basically everything is on its basic level related to reproductive success. Any choice that males and females make till today are related, and it doesn't matter if they're 19 or 90. It's still, the behavior is still the same, is related to reproductive success. The choice of the car, the choice of the job, sowieso the choice of the partner, the choice of the handbag, the choice of the ring, the choice of the ring that the male gives, yeah, all these kind of things, is in its base related to either status, yeah, or securing. Well, status in itself is already a means to obtain, yeah,
Yeah.
reproductive success.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a sort of necessary corollary of Darwin's argument that every evolved attribute subserves the endpoint of relative reproductive success, or selection wouldn't have favored it. That doesn't mean that you're actively pursuing positive reproductive outcomes when you're pursuing these goals. I mean, I think part of what's essential to evolutionary psychology is thinking in terms of the psyche has evolved, but the psyche is an evolved thing that then behaves, and it behaves in novel environments in ways that are often, or even in familiar environments in ways that are often not reproductively effective. And that shouldn't be a surprise. You know, we don't expect guys to be hostile to contraception, um, because they have other agendas than just trying to impregnate the woman right now, um, and or indeed maybe ever. Um, you say the tastes and appetites and feelings and sentiments of the human being, if you've captured them at the right level of abstraction, have been functionally reproductive in ancestral environments. But that's as far as I push the reproductive consequence argument.
Hmm. I think I should have been more specific. Of course, I'm proposing that this is happening all on the subconscious level. Yeah, absolutely. So there's
Well,
no,
yeah, not even subconscious. I mean,
yeah,
that still sort of implies that somehow we're pursuing this agenda, whether we know it or not. And what I'm trying to say is this agenda shaped the evolution of the motives we have, but the execution of those motives does not necessarily entail pursuing this agenda at all.
okay. Let's take the female reproductive cycle as an example. So we know from scientific research that the preference of females, depending, which type of male they prefer, depends on which part of their reproductive cycle they are, right? So this is what I mean when I said at the very beginning, ancient programs in our mind. Because when the female is most fertile, they want the bad guy, the good-looking, musculous, risk-taking bad guy. And when the female is in the least fertile phase of her cycle, she prefers the provider, safety, and so
You
yeah.
you will. I mean, it's a perfectly good example, but I can't resist saying that you will find some well-informed and sophisticated evolutionists who are not impressed with that body of research and think it's been um, the phenomena you say have been stretched and overstated, and they're not maybe all that valid. You will find people arguing against it, but in any case, um, for the more general point, um, yeah, no, that's a perfectly good example. But but let's say that a woman's tastes in men um, have evolved to lean more towards manifestations of physical robustness at fertile times than at other times. Why wouldn't it be at all times? Well, because arguably you're trying to form a bond with the best available bondable male, but you might be interested in sneaking a little cuckoo into the nest once in a while from the best available gene donor. Um, that's the argument. It may or may not make good sense in terms of the selection pressures of the past because, um, maybe cuckolding your husband just wasn't a good idea for a host of reasons, including that he's got relatives and other people who can impose costs on you and your kin. But anyway, it's a good story, but it also highlights the fact that people aren't necessarily doing the right thing now or in response to these things. A woman's tastes may be unaffected by the fact that she has an intrauterine device, even though the alleged function of this behavior is to get copulate with the right man at the right stage of the fertile cycle. Right now, in fact, there is no stage of the cycle that's fertile, and yet this psychology is sort of running off. Or the classic example for talking about this kind of thing is to talk about evolved appetites for sugars or other things that have perhaps been scarce in ancestral environments and are overabundant in contemporary environments. And in the context of overabundance, the appetite isn't turned off, and you're doing your physiology and longevity no favor by your fondness for sugars. Um, there may be a lot of things that are sort of like that.
That's exactly, again, an example that I classify as an ancient program in our mind. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's why I mentioned is it's the kind of thing you're
Yeah.
talking about. It's the idea that, sugars are scarce sources of energy. They always have been. Here's a bunch of sugar, oink, oink, oink. Here's a bunch of refined sugar that none of my ancestors ever encountered. Down the hatch with it.
Coming back to male, female, yeah, and I'm completely digressing from my notes here completely, but I just can't resist. Coming back to male and female, I have another example that I would like to run by you. Again, academic studies done in nightclubs where these ladies dance on those poles. So there's no sex involved. These are just nightclubs, pole dancers, however you call them. Now it turned out the ladies who received the highest tip, and again we talk about ladies who do not take antiception, no pill involved here. Yeah,
Yeah.
the ladies who received the highest tip on top of their fertility cycle. And there's a market difference from about 20 to 25%. So it's not just 1 or 2% that maybe, no, there's a significant, change in the tip rate that the male customers give to these women. So there must be a mechanism that allows that, because we think, female receptivity is hidden. We can't see it, yeah. But apparently that's not entirely true.
Apparently, that's not entirely true. If this result is real and replicable, and I remember hearing of it too, and I think it's quite an interesting thing to have done. It immediately raises the question: what might the mechanism be? And the mechanisms. I mean, the mechanism by which the tippers are influenced or are open quotes detecting close quotes the woman's cycle stage and what the hell they think they're doing with their tips, or rather don't think at all as they're what are they doing with their tips without thinking, because what is this, some sort of misfiring version of a courtship gesture? um, I don't know. But anyway, if are the guys sniffing it out? Um, Conceivably, is the woman's behavior simply more her dance, more provocative, more of the content of it somehow conveys sexual interest in a way that um, a woman with the same pole dancing skill and profession nevertheless fails to deliver when she's menstruating? I don't know. Be kind of nice to know, I guess. I mean, something's going on if it's true, if it's reliable, and I'm happy to believe it might be.
I have a last example, a bit a different one, and it goes back to what I said before, to the argument that basically everything is related to reproduction. And in this case, again, I know who the study did. They rented a red Porsche, put a male, they put males in there for, I don't know, between 25 and 35, and let them drive around. And they measured the testosterone. All the time they measured the testosterone. And it turned out as long as you drive in a neutral environment, nothing happens. But the moment you drive with that car as male on a boulevard with a lot of females, the testosterone compared to a VW, also Volkswagen Beetle, Porsche versus Beetle, spikes sky high. So that might indicate why not only young men but also older men, yeah, buy these type of cars. Again, purely for reproductive success, even though they're already over the age of potential reproduction.
Yeah, or I mean, not that skyrocketing testosterone where you're driving around in a Porsche is going to get you laid necessarily. Um, I mean, you know, it may or this may or may not be an effective um, thing response in the pursuit of reproductive opportunity, even never mind success. Um, Sexual opportunity, it may or may not.
Well, we
It's
know
like,
that
but it's I guess one would argue, I guess probably whoever did this study would argue that the immediate elevation of testosterone in these contexts has to do with sort of psychological readiness to engage in courtship behavior or approach behavior to try and charm a woman. You've got a leg up on it. You've got something that should already be a lure. The chances that you will suddenly find yourself in a courtly circumstance are raised by the combination of the car and the environment, and therefore the testosterone is part of prep for
mm,
being ready to do this. I don't know.
mm.
Um,
Well, we know that the men go for beauty, means for symmetry, and female go for status and resources. So a red Porsche clearly is a sign of status and resources, no?
yeah, yeah, no, and I mean, I would imagine that that if you had women rate men's faces for attractiveness while they're um, dubbed into driving a Volkswagen versus a Porsche, that the same face would be rated more attractive driving the Porsche. I imagine that would be seems like a fairly obvious hypothesis. I wouldn't bet the family farm on it working out terribly well, but I think it's a reasonable hypothesis.
Yes, you're spot on. There was actually research done exactly that. Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. Good. Martin, I would like to go a little bit to homicide, but also killing the competition. Yeah, and again, I'm completely diverting from my script is out of the window. Yeah, but
I've got a copy of it here, which I can flash. There you go.
yes, very good, very good. So let's start with killing the competition because I have not had the chance to read it yet. Yeah.
Oh,
So tell me.
well, basically, in our earlier book, Homicide, which you've read, what we did that was new was a lot of demographic and other predictions and analyses of homicide. Most of sociological homicide studies prior to that book, which is now 36 years old, that homicide book, um, was concerned with the question of predictors of rate differentials. Why are homicide rates higher in the US than in other rich countries? Why are homicide rates so variable across the world? Hundredfold variable between the worst countries and the best, or at least the least violent. Um, and one of the predictors that has always come out in sociological studies was economic inequality. Income inequality, usually measured as the Gini index of income inequality within the country. So a country with high inequality tends to have a higher homicide rate, all else equal. Um, and and the U.S. has exceptional inequality for a rich country, as well as exceptional homicide rate for a rich country. In any case, um, this idea has been floating around for a long time. I thought it sat well with an evolution minded view of male-male competition being exacerbated by inequitable access to resources, and guys get dangerous when they're on track to be losers. And when there are losers, like complete losers, like unmarriageable individuals who are likely to die young. And then it's like, well, I better escalate my tactics of social competition because somebody's making out like a bandit and it's not me. And that kind of mentality, I think, pretty clearly is at play in guys who readily resort to violence. So anyway, this book, Killing the Competition, a lot of people have found that income inequality is a good predictor of homicide rates. But of course, most studies that do this kind of thing have a whole bunch of predictors, some of which are statistically significant, some of which are not, some of which are consistent across studies, some of which are not, some of which seem to work at one scale but not at another scale. And people can argue endlessly about the priorities among them because they're usually not completely unrelated to each other either. So there have been a lot of arguments against the notion that inequality is actually a driver of homicide as opposed to an incidental correlate of homicide rates. And one is that the real culprit is just so-called absolute poverty or desperation, where people are desperate are also unequal, but it's the fact that some people are desperate. Um,
Can I ask you something? Sorry to interrupt, because I failed. It's my bad. I failed to understand something. You say inequality, but is it not just being poor?
well, that's
Because
exactly what I mean by the question of
okay,
inequality versus poverty. You
okay,
could say you could have a society which is highly equitable and everybody's poor. You could have the circumstance, as prevailed in within many hunter-gatherer populations where there's very little material wealth and very little inequity. Um, and you could have a circumstance where there's a great deal of material wealth, and at least in principle, you could have that and very little inequity. Um, so you can separate the two a bit. And, you know, an example, we did a Canadian analysis a number of years ago. Um, People have shown in the US that across states, the states with the highest income inequality have the highest homicide rates, but they're also the states with the highest rates of people living below the poverty line. They're the same states. They were Louisiana, Mississippi, certain particular states. Actually, nowadays, that correlation has weakened because places like New York don't have particularly high poverty rates, but they have very high inequality. But anyway, um, there has been an association between inequality and poverty, where inequality is high, poverty tends to be high in the US. We did analysis in Canada, partly because in Canada, the exact opposite is true when you compare across provinces, or was true 20 years ago when we did these analyses, which is that the most equitable provinces are the most Pacific, the ones with the lowest homicide rates. But they're also the poorest. And that was like Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island, certain eastern provinces. Um, the most unequal provinces were the richest, but they still had the highest homicide rates. So it was like, okay, homicide seems to be tracking inequality more than it does poverty here. Um, and anyway, part of what this book is about is a fairly lengthy argument, not all of it necessarily good argument, but I think it's right in general that inequality really is crucial. And other arguments have been raised like, oh, but homicide rates are high in certain primitive tribal societies, and yet they're very egalitarian. And and so there's a bunch of other quibbles that have been raised with the idea that inequality per se matters. And I try and tackle each of those and say, no, inequality per se really does matter. All the available evidence says so. That's the thrust of the book.
that brings me back to the example that I mentioned at the beginning, and again, forgive me, I believe it was in this book, but I'm reading so much, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it was an example from a homicide investigation, a real homicide investigation, which started in a bar, and it started with almost nothing. I think the policeman was puzzled. He said, the guy, also the killer, it was not intentional. They had a fight and one got killed. Yeah, but he said the offender said something like, "Yeah, the guy looked at me the wrong way," or so.
Yeah,
But then when again, was that your case? Did you describe this?
there was
No.
certainly a lot of that kind of stuff in this
Yeah.
book. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So then the reasoning went, the lower you on the status hierarchy, the more you have to lose, and the more aggressive you have to be to upkeep your status vis-a-vis the others, which also have already very little to lose.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
the policeman was really puzzled. He said there was no reason at all. But from an evolutionary perspective, again, going back to reproduction, because there were females present, yeah, it definitely made sense. And we have to be careful. Making sense doesn't mean you justify it. Yeah? I have to
Yeah,
always be
yeah,
very careful
no,
with this.
absolutely. And yes, and the issue of witnesses is essential to this kind of argument too, including same-sex witnesses as well as women. Um, Guys who are, an enormous proportion of homicides in, you know, urban U.S. ghettos um, are senseless in the sense that there's no clear utilitarian motive. They're not robberies. Um, they're two guys chest bumping in a bar. Somebody dissed somebody, which is short for disrespected. And it's people say it's all about respect. And it's like, well, what do you got when you're a guy rock bottom in one of those communities other than respect slash fear from the other guys? You say if I get disrespected and let it go, it's just an invitation to take what little I have and exploit me. I I don't tolerate disrespect well. And most of these so-called trivial altercations, that used to be the terminology in American criminology, I hope they've dropped it. They're not trivial in the minds of the guys. It's like that bastard disrespected me in front of our mutual acquaintances. I had no choice but to pull a weapon or to threaten them or to come back and get them later. Um, you know, and the mindset of these guys, I think, is perfectly intelligible in the social milieus in which they live, in the social and material milieus in which they live.
I have another example from the bar, and this is an example that I saw on YouTube. There was research done in regards to, again, it's in a bar, and they picked out single male and couples. And they brought in a guy who was at least a head taller and wider than everybody else in this room. And this guy came from behind and took the single male's beer, drank it on a number of occasions. And most of the single men did not confront the perpetrator. Totally different if there is a couple, if the male is with a woman. In more than 90% of the cases, even when the male was significantly smaller than the big guy behind him drinking his beer, the male confronted, sometimes quite aggressively, the guy who tried to steal the beer.
Interesting. I haven't heard about this. Where was that done? Do you know?
It's on YouTube. There's a clip on YouTube.
Yeah.
I will see if I can find it. I send it to you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Um, no, that's interesting. And yeah, I mean, social context makes all the difference in the world. If people are very willing to shrug off insults, especially ambiguous insults when there's no witnesses, um, to just laugh them off and call the other person an idiot. For one thing, there's no point insulting you often except to make a point to the witnesses. So they are probably a bit of an idiot for doing it. But yeah, as soon as there's an audience, then it's different. And in this case, the audience being a date, I suppose, usually in most of these cases, or perhaps a spouse. It would be interesting to know whether the guy's responses would be different if it was a date versus, you know, a stable, trustworthy relationship.
So what are you implying?
My guess would be, my guess would be that in the case of a guy with a long-term trusted partner, um, he would be less likely to react aggressively and more likely for both of them to just say, let's leave this fucking place. Um, but that's my guess.
I thought so. Yeah. Okay. Now we briefly discussed killing competition. Can we discuss the content of Homicide a little bit
Sure,
about why men kill men? I think we already scratched on that,
a
yeah.
little bit.
But there's of course the other side also why women kill men. And then I still want to talk about, and let's not forget about step parents. Yeah. But please,
About women killing men sometimes. Um, of course, there are cases where um, women are just engaged in male-like behavior, are robbers and stuff like that. But they're very rare um, that women kill anybody in a context like as a byproduct of committing a robbery. Um, Mostly, when women kill men, they are current or former partners who have been causing those women grief in some way, or who are assaulting them or confining them. Um, you know, a very large proportion of cases in which women kill men are partner cases, spousal cases, I used to like to say, but I don't want to have the implication of a registered marriage. Um, and their responses, I think the evidence is pretty good to oppression by the partners. So, so they're in many, many cases arguably justifiable homicides, like self-defense homicides against an abusive or um, an abusive partner. And certainly that's a huge proportion of all cases in which women kill men. Spouses are a big proportion of all cases in which men kill women too, but a somewhat smaller one. But homicides, cross-sex homicides are most often um, partners in conflict.
I mean, the same is true, of course, the other way around. So the men who kill women are in like 90 whatever percent closely related to the woman. They're not the stranger or something, yeah.
Yeah,
But the
I'm not
question is,
sure. I'm not sure if it would be quite that high because there certainly are, predatory rape murders, and they might constitute a non-trivial proportion of men killing women in some settings. I'm not sure. I mean, well, obviously in warfare, um, but
yeah, excluding warfare for the moment, yeah,
yeah,
excluding warfare
yeah,
for the moment, yeah.
but
But if you look back at evolution, yeah, so from an evolutionary perspective, there must be, this is evolved. So this trait is in everybody. So how come?
well, what trait? I mean, the trait that I think is most relevant to um, male-female conflict that can turn lethal is the fact that men are very sexually proprietary about women. They like to um, they're very concerned about paternity. They're very concerned about retention of the woman. They're very concerned about um, alienation of the woman. If you get a sample of spousal homicide cases, regardless of who ends up killing whom, whether it's the man killing the woman or the woman killing the man, in both cases, you'll find that the vast majority of the cases, if they're attributed to anything, if there's any apparent motive involved, it has to do with the guy resenting the woman either being unfaithful or just wanting out of the marriage. And you could call those in the broad sense both jealousy issues, but male jealousy issues. They're almost never female jealousy issues. You do run into those cases, but they're extremely rare.
Hmm. You just said something very interesting. Let me just see if I get my brain to spit it out correctly. So, jealousy has to do with the rating of the woman, and I'm missing now the exact term that I'm looking for. Yeah, mating value. I think it was
Okay, we'll
used.
say mate
So
value, the
if
woman's, yeah, okay,
yeah. So
sure.
if a couple meets each other and they have both approximately the same mating value, in lack of a better term, I'm still not completely there. This is a different term, yeah. And then the situation changes where the mating value of either the woman or the man goes up or down. That changes the relationship, and this is where male jealousy comes in. And again on a subconscious level, when suddenly the value of the female goes up, and he would not be able to obtain another female in the same
Yeah,
rating, so
I
to
get
speak.
you. I
Yeah,
get you.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, surely that's often a relevant kind of dynamic is like what? Like, well, guys who have suffered an economic setback, and
Losing the job, for example, simple as that. Yeah.
suddenly um, they realize that they are less attractive um, potential catches to the average random female, including their present partner, than they were. Um, become more concerned about the alienation of their present partner, become more concerned about whether she's going to be looking around for a better deal, um, become more controlling. Um, there's surprisingly little investigation of that, considering the enormous amount of interest there is in intimate partner violence and um, male control, men's attempts to control women. The issue of whether, economic shocks exacerbate or mitigate that problem. It's much more often framed and analyzed and discussed in the intimate partner violence literature as if it were kind of a personalities issue. Some guys are controlling guys, um, and some guys are less so, but, you know, and then some feminists say, yeah, but they all are. Um, this is like what we have to put up with in men if indeed we decide we have to put up with men. Um, and I have some sympathy for the last view, but obviously the extent to which men are inclined to control their wives, inclined to be suspicious and concerned, um, must fluctuate in relation to perceptions or cues of their respective values on the mating market. You know, could she do better elsewhere? Shit, she could. Hmm. Um, I had better keep a close eye on her. I had better, tap her phone, or whatever controlling men do. Um, and there's been surprisingly little attention to that question of whether particular kinds of events like an economic shock of one sort or another um, excite greater controlling inclination in men. I think there may be a little bit of literature suggesting actually that female education or female improvement in employment excites greater jealousy and control on the part of their mates than rather than lesser control.
There's some research in regards to female who have high positions in business, yeah, and they are much less likely to be left by their partner than let's say, I don't know, someone working in the fields or so. Yeah, so there's a
Presumably,
market.
the same goes for men who have high positions are much less likely to be dumped by a partner than others, presumably. I mean, perhaps that effect would be. I'd anticipate that effect might be even stronger. That the woman's response to male status would be strong too.
Status and resources. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and result. Yeah,
It
status and the implication of access to resources. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. If we expand this now a little bit into the family, yeah, and I'm specifically aiming at cultures where still, and even cultures here in the Netherlands, we had cases here of, I think it's called blood revenge, like when the family mostly kills the woman, could be the, the woman who married into the family, or it could be the daughter. Yeah, we had cases here in the Netherlands. Yeah,
Oh yeah, no, no, I wouldn't call
so
that blood revenge. So-called honor killings.
honor killings, that's the one. That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, from evolutionary perspective, since since the fact that it still exists, yeah, there must be an evolutionary reason for that, and an adaptive reason for that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the killing could be dysfunctional overreaction. The general notion that um, that in certain social circumstances, an incredibly important um, asset is your daughter as someone whose marriage you can negotiate. Um, and if if you're in that kind of social setting, a social setting where um, senior members of a family consider their daughter's sexual and marital career to be
Property.
property of them, something they can do something useful with.
Hmm.
They can, bestow her here or there to the advantage of their lineage or themselves, then these kinds of things become big issues. Like again, if you like resentment of female autonomy, or the exercise of female autonomy. And the other thing about honor, like family honor, like, a young woman has defied her family in this domain. She's had um, premarital sex with somebody that they don't approve of or don't think is somebody that they want to marry her to. Um, and then you actually have the circumstance where her father or her brothers kills her to maintain family honor. Then I think the family honor issue has to do with advertising that, you know, part of the deal in these societies is you want to be known as a patrilineage that can deliver chaste, dependable brides to your allies in exchange for whatever they're offering. Um, if your bloody daughter shows enough independent mindedness to undermine your reputation for the capacity to do this, then she's undermined your capacity to build alliances. She's undermined your family honor. I mean, I think that's the logic of it. So it probably only happens. I'm trying to think. It probably only happens in society with very strong um, patrilineal traditions and so-called fraternal interest groups where closely related men um, cooperate in political and other ventures. Um, I suspect it's confined to such families, such societies, and so it seems particularly shocking and alien in much of you know the so-called modern West, like the Netherlands, where people are much more wedded to the idea of individual agency and individual choice.
Hmm. I never understood that really. Again, from evolutionary perspective, because basically these families shoot themselves in their own goal, right? So
In a sense, yes, that's right. But it has to be their perception, accurate or not, that the damage this young woman has done to their reputation and the damage that would be done to their reputations by failing to act, um, by publicly acceding to this honor damaging action on her part, is even more costly to them than killing her. I mean, that must be their view of the matter, as I say, accurate or not.
yeah. it's hard to, again, from a Western perspective, it's hard to, you know, to set yourself in this mind frame to even, consider the reasons behind it. Yeah. But from evolutionary perspective, with women being the gate, the bottleneck for reproduction, yeah, it seems to be a very, again, from evolutionary perspective, it seems to be a very costly mechanism to uphold something as,
Yeah, women
as
women women are commodified by men to a degree everywhere, I think. And nice civilized Canadians like me and Dutchmen like you are not completely immune from this, I don't think. Um, the commodification of women is something the male mind moves easily towards.
it's a different kind of commodification, right? Because we in the West, we also do it. Just look around, walk through London or walk through any metropole and look at the PR posters who are and reclame boards who are everywhere put up. Everything is sold via the female body.
Oh, that, yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, what better way to attract attention and the warm glow of thinking whatever is right next to it is also kind of attractive too, than than a babe, draped over the roof of the Porsche or whatever.
Yeah. Um, Sometimes when I talk about evolutionary psychology, I ask people who they think is the biggest danger for children. Maybe you want to elaborate.
Um, I suspect you're inviting me to talk about the so-called Cinderella effect, the risks to kids associated with step parents. And uh,
Correct.
and in this context, I always have to throw out a big caveat because people seem to imagine that if you say step relationships are dangerous, that you're advocating against remarriage, against marital dissolution, certainly once children are born and stuff. Um, Statistically, step parents are very much riskier than genetic parents. And this does not seem to be an artifact of like socioeconomic differences or something like that. Um, Very few very young children live with step parents. You know, they would have to, their surviving parent, which, or their continuing parent, which usually means their mother, would have had to repartner by the time they've already reached whatever their current age is. So kids under the age of about 2, um, nowhere is it common for them to have a stepfather. But where they do, those kids incur very much higher risks of abuse and fatality, and stepchildren incur excess risk of sexual exploitation. Um, Interview studies of victims of sexual assault as sexual exploitation as children always have many more stepfathers involved than there ought to be, in terms of their proportionate numbers in the population at large. This is a ubiquitous finding. A lot of people don't like it. They feel like it's somehow stigmatizing what's already a difficult task, being a step family and being, you know, treating kids who are not your own equitably and as well as you might treat your own. They think that's, psychologically different, which is kind of the point. Um, Difficult, I mean, psychologically difficult, um, which is kind of the point. But think you're just making things harder on step parents to mention this. So you run into a lot of no, no, I don't believe it. It can't be true, uh, kind of stuff on this. But it is true. And again, I say I always feel the need to hedge here by stressing that in the modern world, and indeed in much of the less modern world too, I think, most step relationships are reasonably amicable. Some are loving, mutually supportive. I think they're often a bit more psychologically like, I mean, when you think about parental investment and parental love. It's pretty astonishing. Parents sink their hearts and souls into their kids. They, you could say in a sense, the survival and thriving of offspring is, in a Darwinian perspective, the meaning of life, the objective of life. It's what you're here for, is to let the little buggers, suck the marrow from your bones and then drop dead. That's what you're here for. And it's expensive, and it's completely different from other kinds of cooperative relationships, which always have an element of reciprocity and resentment of non-reciprocity. Um, and it's a one-way street. Parents invest in their kids, and some of them, it's true, demand the kids take care of them in old age and so on. But in general, no, it's a one-way street. And it's a lot to ask of somebody who enters into a relationship with a new partner because they fancy the new partner, they fancy the relationship, it appeals. Unfortunately, that partner happens to come along with the baggage of a kid from a prior union. Well, I love you so much, I intend to try to be a good dad to your kid, even. That's how much I want you. Um, and that's often the bargain of establishing step relationships. And many, many, many people succeed to some degree in that, although the kind of selfless love they feel towards their own kids, maybe not. Um, but some proportion of them just resent the little buggers. I mean, you know, you get homicides where the guy says, the little bugger I just changed his diaper, and then he wouldn't stop crying. So of course I lost it. Wouldn't anybody? That's why I battered him to death. And it's like, well, no, actually, anybody wouldn't. Um, you're in this position of being called upon to play parent to a kid who you feel no parental feelings towards, and that's not good. Um, so yeah. Anyway, you know, Margot Wilson and I, decades ago, like originally in 1980, in collaboration with a student, Suzanne Weghorst, who first suggested somebody should study this. We did the first study to show that there was excess risk to stepchildren. It was kind of amazing because people have been studying child abuse intensively since the mid 60s, but it wasn't until 1980 that anybody collected data, asked the question, are stepchildren at greater risk? And the answer is yes. Um, and it seems to be yes pretty much everywhere, but there's big variability in the magnitude of Cinderella effects, by which I mean excess risk to children living with a step parent compared to living with their genetic parents. There's big cross-national variability, and there's temporal variability as well. And that's and nobody's investigated these things well. Nobody's investigated them adequately. Why is it that the magnitude of Cinderella effects has apparently fallen in certain countries quite a lot over the last 30 years or so? The degree of excess risk to stepchildren. I think um, it helps if there's other systems in place for support of children um, at a societal level. Um, I think other kinds of gross changes can make a big difference, and this is a badly under-investigated topic.
Where I would like to go with this is very briefly, is from evolutionary perspective, there is a reason for that behavior, and I would like you to flush this out.
Well, I mean, I think there's a reason for reluctance to invest in other children, or if you like, a reason for individualized bonding to children likely to be your own, who you have confidence are your own or strong reason to believe your own, and to value them more highly than other kids. I'd say the killing of kids and even the physical and sexual abuse are more byproducts of that differential affection than they are, you know, adaptations means to the end of reproduction in their own right. Um, Killing stepchildren, well, it is something that some non-human animals certainly do. That
Exactly.
male,
Lions, chimpanzees.
yeah, the famous examples are um, Langer monkeys and some other monkeys where they're organized into single male, multi-female troops. And when a new male succeeds in deposing the former male, he systematically seeks out nursing infants and kills them, because the mothers will come into estrus sooner that way, and he can fertilize them sooner and all that. And it makes eminent sense in those cases. I don't think it makes sense in the human case. I don't think there's any evidence in any society that killing a stepchild is actually good for a guy's reproductive success. I mean, I think you know, you run afoul of justice systems in countries with justice systems, but you run afoul of the woman's relatives. Um, it's, in our species, killing the kid is not, surely not adaptive, and it's rare. I mean, it's relatively rare, that you say, oh, it's way more likely than killing your own kid. Yeah, but it's still like 1 in 1,000 stepkids who's actually going to be killed. When
Is that the actual number? Is that the actual number? 1 in 1,000?
um, talking about very, very young ones, approximately, yeah, under 5. As they get older, it's less likely, but of course, then there's other options like they leave. Stepchildren leave home younger and so on. But anyway,
So they're
so yeah,
so
it's
they're
still
really
very rare. And my point is just that it's not killing that's the evolved adaptation, but it's differential parental affection and relative antipathy towards those kids that is. I mean, people kill their own kids sometimes, even. Sometimes a kid who interrupts his father who's trying to play a video game gets beaten to death. But I think it's wiser to interrupt your father than it is your stepfather.
that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I only wanted to point out, also from evolutionary perspective, it's of course about propagating their own genes. Yeah, and then what you just said is absolutely correct. The younger children are at greater risk, but again, this is a pattern, right? And we're not talking about individuals or individuals feeling not the same thing to their stepchildren. Yeah, it's the evolution. There is a mechanism that has survived throughout evolution, and the very fact that it has survived must have at some level an evolutionary benefit.
Yeah, and I would say identify the adaptation, identify the hypothesized psychological adaptation. And in this case, I would say it's discriminative parental solicitude, discriminative parental affection. Um, you don't care equally for all little kids. Some people, my mother was an example, um, ooh and ah and goo goo over every damn baby. They think they're all cute, but nobody loves them equally. You don't. Um, and people discriminate in favor of the better prospects. There's lots of evidence that they love the healthy and
Symmetrical.
baby better than the deformed, sickly baby. Even though the deformed, sickly baby may be more in need of their care. There's that, and then there's the issue of, is it likely to be my own? And this is usually not a problem for women to know. For men, it's more problematic. But so doubt about paternity is almost certainly something that raises risk to children as well. But we don't really tend to have good data on things like the level or incidence of doubt about paternity in a sample of kids who are killed versus a control sample. Um, you know, but we do have step relationships, which are arguably of that ilk. Now, adoptive relationships are an interesting control in many cases because the kid's not yours, just like the step kid's not yours, but you're in a position in loco parentis to it. You're supposed to behave as parent to the child. Um, but all evidence indicates that the risks actually tend to be low in modern adoptions. They're not low in adoption generally. You have to bear in mind that until very recently, many adoptions were exploitative. Adoptees were, you know, farm labor or apprentices with no marital prospects. Um, they were taken on as labor in many cases. But in modern adoption, you're trying to simulate a natural family. And if we're talking about adoption by stranger, bringing in an unrelated child, um, people have often suggested, well, if it's a matter of referring your own genes, then these people ought to be at high risk too. And they're not. Um, all evidence suggests they're not statistically at high risk. Um, but you made this decision. It's an active decision on the part of both parts. And the missing element probably is any resentment of your investment being somehow exploited by your partner, which I think is psychologically an element of the resentment of stepchildren sometimes. Um, I got suckered into this, um, whereas, it's harder to say that about consensual agreement to adopt. And of course, adoptive parents tend statistically to be more affluent if you're talking about stranger adoptions than the average parent. And none of this typically gets into the analyses. So, the adoption case is interesting, but I don't think it's counter evidence.
So I said before, this interview goes in a totally different direction than I originally planned. That's not bad. So following this line of argumentation, I would, with your kind permission, I have two more topics, issues that
Okay.
I would like to bring up, but I do not know if you want to. Yeah, incest and rape. Would
Uh-huh.
it be okay?
I guess
So,
so.
and
I don't claim to be any great expert on either of them.
no, but from evolutionary, really purely from evolutionary perspective, and I said it a couple of times before already, those can we call it traits? It's not really a trait. I know I'm not 100% accurate in my description here, but both interest and rape must have evolutionary benefits for our race. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so prevalent,
Well, again, you say for
right?
our race, which makes it sound too much like it's been good for Homo sapiens rather than good for
Okay.
some guy. Um, if
Well,
you
but
say,
if you talk about evolution, we cannot just talk about the guy, because if we talk about evolutionary traits, then we talk about, I don't know, thousands of generations,
no, but
and
I mean,
both.
but I mean the criterion of being selected is it increases the actor's relative reproductive success, regardless of whether it's doing the species any good or not. So,
Yeah.
um, that which is naturally selected, that which is favored, is that which benefits the actor's share of future gene pools. Even if it's diminishing those future gene pools, it'll still be selected if it increases the
Yeah.
actor's share. So,
Yeah, and I shouldn't have said our race, because it happens in non-human species too,
yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, you know, rape.
So if we start with incest, sorry,
Okay.
or with rape, whatever,
I
you
was
go
going to
ahead.
say, I mean, rape seems the more straightforward of the two in a way. The idea that, you know, typically what we have meant by rape until, it got very politically fraught to talk about any, to differentiate types of sexual assault. Typically, what we have meant was forced copulation by a male on an unwilling female. And, you know, I would expect that this is dangerous behavior. It can lead the rapist to be um, punished by the kin of the woman. I mean, thinking about past environments, it's high risk behavior. It's not something you necessarily undertake unless you're a bit desperate or unless the perceived costs plummet, like in the context of war, where somehow it seems many guys, perhaps because their own time horizons have shifted, the perceived risk of mortality has skyrocketed. But or perhaps because the costs seem to have vanished. But many guys seem to become rapists in war who would not otherwise have become rapists.
Which brings us back to Israel, interestingly.
Hmm. Yeah, I haven't heard much about
Yeah, they
rape
were
there,
they
but
were
I have heard.
publicly discussing on, I think it's called Channel 10, publicly discussing to allow rape as a means of torture on Palestinians. I mean, this is spread all over the news. It's publicly discussed. I mean, they caught a couple of soldiers on. I mean, it's just crazy. Yeah? So
Yeah,
that, and they're not isolated incidents.
yeah,
Anyway, I don't want to point in this direction, but again,
yeah. No, but I
evolutionary.
mean, again, I mentioned rape in warfare because that seems like the kind of context where the perceived costs would go down, and perhaps the sort of, you know, notion that it's your last chance for inseminating anybody might also go up. But anyway, um, it does seem to be a context in which men become more rape prone, and men who would not have imagined themselves capable of it perpetrate it. It does seem to be some
But
context. But
that's today. But that's today. But from evolutionary
no, but I mean
perspective, that
historically too, that's always probably been true that raping women in contexts of warfare, the risk to women that they would be raped by invading men goes up, I imagine. I imagine that's always been true. But but just talking within a society, who's going to, say it's costly to be a rapist. It's been penalized. It's been penalized severely. It's been, next to a homicide, it's been the most likely thing to have a death penalty associated with it that's actually carried out, maybe even more likely than on homicides, actually. Um, so it's high risk behavior. It's deterred by the risks. Um, and, men like to think, and part of nurturing your image as a good cooperator, as somebody other people would like to be allied with, um, it's good to be thought of as somebody who doesn't engage in antisocial action. I mean, there are deterrents of that sort too, which I think are very real, have always been real, have been real in human history for a very, very long time. And so I think there's reasons why men might be disinclined to engage in rape, and yet, you know, they clearly can. That in itself is kind of interesting to think if it's quotes natural or normal somehow for sex to be consensual and rape is pathological. Um, why can guys even get it up in this context of wouldn't an unwilling female just be a turnoff? Um, wouldn't it just be a signal that, you know, this is not what I hoped for and stop it? Um, but stop it doesn't seem to be, a totally effectual thing to say to rapists. Um, so yeah, I think rape must historically have paid off sometimes, whether it's historically paid off often enough to warrant talking about an adaptation for rape as just compared to adaptations for men being more sexually interested than women, more sexually aggressive than women, less inclined to understand that no means no than women, you know. Um,
and if we briefly, the last one, incest. And again, I'm looking for the evolutionary
yeah. Well, again, I mean,
adaptation,
on the one hand, mating with close relations tends to be damaging to fitness because of inbreeding avoidance. Um,
which is kind of an oxymoron from an evolutionary perspective. Yeah, if you talk about the health of genes and propagation of healthy genes, that's the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, inbreeding avoidance is the phenomenon. I mean, inbreeding depression rather is the phenomenon of lower fitness of individuals who are the product of inbreeding, and it's usually because they've got a greater degree of heterozygosity in their genomes and maybe the higher probability of expression of rare deleterious alleles and that sort of thing. And there's lots of pretty good evidence that um, inbreeding is has negative effects on the fitness of human beings too. Although it's much stronger for relationships down to about R equals one quarter, half sibling and uncle niece relationships and stuff like that, and then stronger still for parent, young or full sibling relationships. It is very low for first cousins, the negative fitness consequences. And indeed, cousin marriages have been prescribed, not just proscribed, but prescribed in many, many societies. And they're not considered incest. So what's considered incest is labile. Um, but you might imagine that in many cases, a male would think that the benefit of impregnating his daughter or his niece instead of some unrelated guy doing it in terms of gene propagation is going to be enough to pay the costs and more of the inbreeding depression. So you could imagine, I mean, it would be a first pass hypothesis that incestuous mating would be tempting to males not as a first or primary mate comparison to outbreeding, but as a, and here's somebody else I can inseminate on the side. And that happens. Doesn't happen very often. I think it doesn't happen very often for a variety of reasons of, people having to maintain other kinds of social relationships and cooperative. Um, it, it's clearly, there are clearly incest avoidance mechanisms that have evolved. Um, it's clear that being raised in close proximity, a lot of studies have shown this now. Girls and boys who are raised together just feel no sexual attraction to one another as if they were siblings, whether they're siblings or not. And that's a pretty widespread phenomenon. There's an allegation, and I've seen some people amassing anecdotes on this, but I have no idea how good the data are um, that this actually is going against a tendency to be attracted to people who are closely related to if you don't know it, and that that opposite sex siblings who are separated in youth um, uncannily often are sexually attracted to each other if they encounter one another in adulthood and don't know their siblings. This is a claim. I don't have no idea if the data are any good, if the evidence is any good. But in terms of attraction, people and other animals show some tendency to be attracted to people who are intermediately related to them, not too close, but also not too distant. And there may be a genetic optimization of the quality of offspring by doing that sort of thing. There may be. The interesting thing about incest that has been drawn attention to, especially by the anthropologist Nancy Thornhill, is that the way the term's tossed around in the anthropological literature, and to some extent in other literatures as well, has a lot to do with the manipulation of who's entitled to marry whom, marriage rules rather than sex rules. And it has a lot to do with the politics of marital negotiations, so that decrying incestuous unions in some ways is kind of a cheap way of advancing your personal interests against other people's interests in a competitive marriage market. This argument has been made in great detail by some anthropologists, I think especially of Nancy Thornhill 40 years ago, 30 something years ago. But I don't know how much more I have to say about it than that. There is the incest aversion among close siblings. There is nevertheless a very hard to know, but
No, I was
still
especially interested incest between
father-daughter
father and
incest.
daughter, father and daughter. Yeah.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, it happens. It happens. I think it's pretty infrequent. I think it's pretty
Depends.
infrequent everywhere, but I don't know that.
Depends what is infrequent. In overall absolute numbers, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But I am in contact with someone from the Dutch police who is investigating these kind of cases. And it's also from his perspective, it's definitely not only anecdotal.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
As a, yeah,
There's enough of them to keep an officer
yeah, yeah,
making
yeah,
that his
absolutely,
specialty.
absolutely. Professor Martin Daly, you were very generous with your time. I have to say, this again, I said it already 3 times. This went completely in a different direction. There would be many other things that I would be interested in discussing with you. If anyone, well, let me end with the last question. Yeah,
Okay.
in my mind, you can only, and I make it again. I know I make it very black and white. In my mind, you can only understand human behavior really through the lens of evolutionary psychology.
Thank you.
Am I exaggerating? Am I exaggerating?
Uh, no, I think that's fair, and there's nothing particularly remarkable of human beings in that regard. The same goes for the behavior of any animal.
Okay, good, good.
Thank you.
Professor, I thank you very much for your time. It's really appreciated. I
Thank you.
wish you all the best. I recommend again one more time this book for anyone if you know why people kill people, and the newest book, Killing Competition. Yeah, I truly recommend it. I truly recommend it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining, Professor.
Thank you, Thomas.
If this interview got you thinking, questioning, or even arguing with yourself, that's exactly the point. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. Over on my Substack, I take these big ideas and dig even deeper, breaking down the complexities, connecting the dots, and explore what they mean for all of us. Whether it's about today's topic, the next one, or one from the past, my Substack is where the real deep dive happens. So if you're ready for more insights, thought-provoking analysis, and a space to challenge your own perspective, join me there. It's free and the link is in the description below. I can't wait to see what you think.